Hi, I'm Mike Hudson, Director of the Museum of the American Printing House for the Blind. Welcome to the Redux presentation of sessions from the Hidden Legacies of Helen Keller Symposium, which was held in Louisville, Kentucky on September 17th and 18th, 2022. The symposium, with primary sponsorship from the American Printing House for the Blind and the Filson Historical Society, brought together scholars, writers, and Keller enthusiasts from across North America. In 2020, the American Foundation for the Blind Helen Keller Archive arrived at our museum on 23 pallets. And since then, our staff has been busy cataloging, describing, measuring, and inventorying this most amazing history of one of the most amazing women of the 19th and 20th centuries. I'm sitting in front of her desk from her house at Arcan Ridge. Helen Keller was a writer, activist, advocate, ambassador, and world traveler who profoundly affected the way the world thinks about people with disabilities. And yet, she is little understood, often frozen in time as a little girl with her hand under the water pump behind her parents' home in Tuscumbia, Alabama. Our symposium was just a beginning effort to bring together the most current scholarship in innovative ways to better understand Keller, her companion Anne Sullivan, and her times. We hope you enjoy the series. Each session will be dedicated to a single speaker from the symposium. Our third session on Saturday afternoon was titled Tracing Evidence: Picturing Keller, Reproductive Advocacy, and Eugenics in the Progressive Era. The panel used film clips from multiple genres of silent films produced in the Progressive Era to explore how the U.S. public imagination was persuaded, or not, about different issues and values in public health, eugenics, reproductive control, and policy. The fourth and final presenter in that session was linguist Ted Supalla from Georgetown University. Dr. Supalla, a neurolinguist studying ASL as a heritage language, focuses on the development and survival of ASL when he describes how George Veditz's use of film as a scientific tool in 1913 facilitates understanding ASL's evolution across generations. This presentation also tracks how spoken language communities influence the syntax of signed languages and how signed languages flourish and transform when brought into new deaf communities who make it their own.
Hello. I was invited to talk about understanding ASL as a heritage language. I'll explain exactly what that means first. Contemporary American Sign Language, what I'm using now, is not a series of ad hoc gestures or creations. It's a language that has existed for generations, which is why I specify heritage in the title. Now today, you've likely seen old films documenting sign language, like the one shown here. This film is often described as a model of beautiful language, but a challenge for you to consider is that the theme of that film is the preservation of sign language, because it was under threat even 100 years ago. The lecturer was George Veditz. He was an educator by profession, but was also active in the fight for the right to use signs. I'll discuss his concerns, but I want to point out that he wasn't the only one. I've included a panoramic photo of the NAD members who raised funds to make the film series. That's right, there are more films of lectures in sign language, but the Veditz film garners a lot of attention because his topic is so important: the preservation of sign language. So this was not just an individual stewardship effort, it was a collective effort among the deaf community. And it wasn't a one-off project either. It was one part of a continuous effort that has lasted to the present day, which begs the question, why do we have to fight for this right? Here's a roadmap of my talk to help everyone follow along. But first, I should introduce myself. I'm a researcher, I'm deaf, My name is Ted Supalla, and to say my name in ASL, tuck your thumb under your index finger and tap it twice on your chin. Now I'd like to address how I plan to give today's talk. I know that some in the audience are blind, so I've tried to sequence my slides carefully. Wherever I have text, I plan to point and allow enough time for each of you to read it. I might have a single line of text or multiple. Where I have multiple, I'll read them all, then reread each one as I discuss it. I'll do the same thing with images, allowing enough time for interpreters so that blind and deafblind people can access them. I hope it all works. This presentation is multimedia in that I'm giving the presentation in ASL. It was translated and voiced over, and captions were added. Hopefully you'll enjoy it. Now I'll point to the first subheading and pause for the interpreter to read it aloud. Even during cycles of neglect or oppression by the larger hearing society, we continue to nourish and steward its journey. I'd like to draw your attention to the terms neglect and oppression. In the context of broader hearing society, which is largely non-signing, we face the challenge of always having to explain why we need to use ASL. If we don't do this, we run the risk of being ignored or forgotten, and we may be seen as different or even stamped out. This is what has happened repeatedly over time. Now we know from these experiences that we have to plan for how to preserve our language and nourish it. We are and always have been responsible for its stewardship. Here's the next point. To ensure strong, everlasting stewardship, we need to better understand our history of struggles and competing ideas. What's important here is that this has been done by trial and error with some successes, so we need to make a good plan. We also need to explain ourselves in a way that doesn't oversimplify the issues. They are multifaceted, and even we need to know this history. Moreover, we need to know the context of these historic struggles with hearing society when they've made decisions that adversely impact us or when they create alternative solutions. Secondly, the competing ideas are those different approaches I just mentioned. When hearing society has different notions about us, we have to keep explaining ourselves to correct and solve the issues that they create. I'll let you read the title first. Before digging into its history, we must first know who uses ASL to fully understand how it is used. I'll discuss the distinction between fluent ASL users and those in the community who are not. I'll also talk about how signed language is used and learned, as it's not just intuition or invention. On to the first point about the who. Fundamental demographics of the deaf community. The majority of children born to deaf adults are hearing. So to clarify, deaf people do not always have deaf children. In fact, most have hearing children. Deaf parents sign to their hearing children and they acquire the language, so they're also a part of the deaf community. They're referred to as codas. The recent movie by the same name has helped spread awareness that deaf people don't live in isolation. We get married and we have children too. Next, I'll talk about some proportions. Census records refuted fear about threat of deaf race. There was a growing concern that deaf adults would intermarry, have deaf children, and create a deaf race, which is now known to not be true, but this was a very real fear 100 years ago. Proponents of the idea cautioned people that a deaf race could exist. I'll discuss what was behind that belief, but for now, the point is that the fear existed because people didn't know what it would mean for deaf people to have children. only 5% of deaf adults have deaf children. And among deaf children, only 5% are from deaf families. The remaining 95% are from hearing families and are born deaf because of illness or genetics. Hearing people often don't know when they're carriers, although there is more awareness now. Going back to the point about fears of the threat of a deaf race, what was that based on? The fact that deaf adults sign and a fear that their children would learn and use signs, which might lead to a desire to live as a separate signing community that could grow unchecked. I'll describe some of the plans and actions taken to prevent this from happening, but the point I'd like to make is, again, that deaf people are not always born into homes in which they would even acquire sign language to begin with. Let's start by looking at differences in language exposure. In general, one must be surrounded by a community of language users to learn or acquire that language. But today, we're talking about Helen Keller's legacy. So I'll point out that she did not grow up as a signer. No members of her family used ASL or signed at all, but they did hire a teacher to communicate with her through fingerspelling only. Her age is also important. Helen could initially hear and speak, as she was born hearing, but at 1.5, she became deaf and blind due to an illness. Now suddenly being deaf-blind, what did the family do? Interestingly, Helen later recalls having used home signs with her parents and other relatives to express her needs. What exactly are home signs? I'll describe that now. Several case studies now show that when a deaf person is born into a hearing family, they create their own home sign systems. They may draw on gestures that they see used in the environment around them and add to them because they have to express their needs. They continue building on these signs and end up being better at using them than their own parents. This has been shown among young deaf children, but what happens if a child grows up with only hearing non-signers and continues to use home signs? There are case studies of adults in this situation. I've met one such person, and I'll show you an example of what their signs are like. Here's an image of a multi-sign construction for snake. It's made up of 2 signs: a flexed index finger moving forward, which means to strike, like this, followed by this sign, meaning to slither. The index finger is now extended, and this sign has a different movement. It goes side to side, like this. The pairing of both signs is needed to satisfy the intent, maybe because when they were younger, people didn't clearly understand if they only used one of the signs, but adding the second one clarified the meaning. Their interactive experiences were only with hearing non-signers, but they could depend on visual cues to be understood. Maybe this ability to tap into the human capacity for gesture is what home signers use as the basis to build a language, even into adulthood. I should add that this adult home signer never went to school. They live on a remote island, and the images on the slide are recreations of signs that we captured as part of our study. Now I'll discuss what it's like when a deaf child has a signing family. The key difference is that in this case, the deaf child is surrounded by an accessible language. They can see people in their environment signing. The child will start signing and continue signing into adulthood. There's ample documentation of this from the past 20, 30 years, but for confidentiality reasons, footage can't be shown publicly. The footage is always coded, and only the data is shared. So, I'll show you footage of my own home movies as examples. I've pulled 3 freeze frames from the films, and I have them displayed on the left side of the screen. In the middle of each image is a father and mother, flanked by 2 children. The child on the left is older and sitting on the father's lap. He's a boy, and his baby brother is seated across from him on the mother's lap. This is my family, and I'm the baby in the picture. I was 1 year old at the time. Now, I'll discuss how the family uses their eyes when communicating with each other. I'll point out the relevant parts of each image in order starting at the top with the same picture that I just described. Look at each person's hands and eyes. The mother's hand is on the baby's belly like this. The reason for this is to get his attention. Touch is required for getting attention. The father and brother are also looking in that direction because, as one would expect in a family, they're looking to see what the baby will do. So the eyes are important. That's why we're considered a visual people. Now let's look at the next image. Three arrows now appear over the eyes and hands. The father and brother are now looking elsewhere because the mother is now pointing to a location off camera. Obviously, the family is going to look to where somebody is pointing, and that's what happened here. Now they're all looking off camera, but the baby is not yet. He's still excited and waving his hands. What about, I don't know or remember. But let's see what happens in the next image. In the third image, everyone's eyes are on the baby again. I'll point out where the father and brother are looking with line of sight arrows. Apparently they knew that the baby was still otherwise occupied, but the mom knew to give him a second. And at that point, he does look to where she had been pointing, shown here. This confirms that the baby understood what was happening and the use of space. That indicated that he was ready for visual communication. The family would wait. Rather than using a barrage of vocabulary when a kid isn't looking, they followed my milestones, which is the same as what's done with spoken languages. Adults don't use language that's too advanced for children. We use age-appropriate language, and we see that here with a 1-year-old. Next, I'd like to show clips from another home movie. We have a bunch of home movies that I inherited. I'm 5 in this one. I'm alone in the clip, but I seem to have learned how to direct my family. My dad is behind the camera filming and seems to have been interested in how I'd communicate. There will be me seated in the center of the shot, and you'll see another boy come in, my younger brother. Watch for how he communicates with me. Again, this involves contact because he apparently needs to tell me something, and then he goes off camera again. In the clip, I'm signing to the camera, and it seems I knew I was being recorded. and that we would watch the movie later at the next family movie night. Here it is. Oh, before I hit play, I want to point out that gloss translations are available below the video. These are the meanings of each sign that I use when I'm talking to the camera. The words are have, tractor, wagon, and house. Now I'll play the clip. This one shows more complex family dynamics. Lots of hand movement, some attention getting, plus I'm talking to the camera, or getting my father's attention, so that he'd be ready to record me while I talked about what I got for Christmas. Christmas in general is a great time for families' home movies, and this is one example of that, as was the film that was made when I was a year old. Next on our roadmap is the topic of raising awareness about the history of ASL and its status as a true language. The slide is entitled Everlasting Challenge, Promoting Status of Sign Language. Gauging the status of sign languages should not only be comparisons to spoken languages, but assessments of each language and their own heritages. That means each language community's ideas have to be respected and their rules followed. What's happened historically is that non-signers often suppressed signing based on their fears. Now, sign language legacies are prone to fragmentation because communities are divided along competing ideas about signing and speaking, or doing what broader society wants. That harms us because A, stakeholders are pitted versus language policy in society. In other words, real people with shared desires, stakeholders, are isolated and, facing obstacles, seek out like-minded people, then decide to do something which leads to solidarity. This has always been the case. Just like in Veditz's time, he and a community of stakeholders faced this a century ago. And it still happens today because of broader social policies. Policies that are intended to replace what deaf communities use with various methods of communication. The onus is constantly on us then to try to follow these policies only to fail. Is it all an experiment? Or do they really want us to be like them? That challenge is summed up in point B, policy driven by, quote, restoring the deaf to society. Because society's definition of a normal person is someone who speaks, they want deaf people to speak as well. Hearing parents may want their deaf children to speak just like they do. Their fears are assuaged by those who say that they have a plan for how deaf children can be successfully restored to society. Here's one example of that from when I was young, in 1967. I was about 15 at the time, and a nearby school made a film and distributed it to parents as a way to show what was expected of their children's behavior. Teachers were involved in the making of the film as well and recorded students' performance. The title of the film was Social Graces in School, and it was made by the Parent-Teacher Association of the California School for the Deaf at Riverside. Several people brought this film to my attention. Unfortunately, I can't show it here, but I'll describe it to you. Students were sorted into two groups, given separate instructions, and filmed separately. One group was labeled as having bad behavior, And as it turns out, they were using language that looks the same as how we sign today. They were using ASL. I reflected on my own upbringing and thought about how many times I was told not to sign the way I normally did and instead to behave properly, which is exactly what was shown in the film's good behavior group. They communicated by fingerspelling only. Why was that? You have to look at when the film was made. At the time, Helen Keller was the only model people could turn to. She not only spoke, she used the manual alphabet. So when schools and parents needed a visual form of communication, they would follow what Helen Keller did. Parents who wanted to improve communication with their adolescent children were encouraged to use fingerspelling as a solution. Now, the challenge we have to consider is that as the children who were taught this way got older, they had been conditioned to believe that society would only tolerate the use of fingerspelling. Now I'll discuss common concerns among stakeholders. What is it that broader society really wants? Deaf people are evaluated as being successful models or failures according to societal standards of behavior, speaking ability, or their command of the grammar of the dominant language, English. And if deaf people want to use different codes, writing is allowed, speaking is allowed, and fingerspelling is allowed. Now being limited to those three options, deaf children can succeed in the dominant language. But this poses a challenge to those of us whose native language is not English. What about those who already have a visual language? The first challenge is how to restore the legacy of sign language. We have to educate society that there are large numbers of people, not only in the US, but worldwide, who use sign languages but are being denied the right to use them. That means we have to safeguard sign language heritage, because if sign languages can't be passed on to deaf children, they'll be deprived of language, which we absolutely cannot let happen. These efforts are already underway and have reached the level of the United Nations, which has declared that deaf children have the right to learn signed languages. How do we ensure that these international successes apply at the local level as well? And how do we ensure sustainability and quality assurance? When ASL stakeholders try to insist on quality assurance, there's confusion regarding claims of authority. I'll show you a few examples that have posed real challenges for us. The first one is the fake interpreter at the Nelson Mandela Memorial. How could there be a fake interpreter at the memorial for someone as prominent as Nelson Mandela, a real hero of South Africa? His death was an international event, and his funeral was attended by world leaders and dignitaries. So it was remarkable that they dedicated space for an interpreter. However, deaf people from all over the world could tell that something was off. If you don't sign, you might not be able to tell why this looks different from real signed languages. But signers had plenty of reasons to be skeptical. I'll show you a clip. The amount of repetition was unusual. But what could someone do in that moment? Replace the person on stage so publicly? No. So he stayed there throughout the entire ceremony. Of course, deaf people were upset and questioned the interpretation, only to find out that this person was schizophrenic and believed he knew a signed language. Apparently, the event organizers took him at his word with no verification and hired him. This was appalling to the deaf community that we would still have such problems with quality assurance of interpreters at such a high-profile event. Here's the next example. How can we show people who hire interpreters that we already have ways of vetting fluency? Some say that interpreters should take classes, but government officials make the hiring decisions and believe people who claim they're fluent enough to interpret. This creates a real challenge for the deaf community, as we also have to fight for the right to assess interpreters. This problem still isn't resolved, but I bring this up as a reminder to look to the past for their solutions to quality assurance. I looked into this and found that in 18th and 19th century Europe, literary societies existed at deaf schools and clubs for teenagers and young adults to compete in demonstrating their oratory skills in sign languages. These expositions were well attended, and some presenters were celebrated while others were encouraged to keep practicing in order to reach higher levels. What happened to these competitions? They no longer existed in the 20th century. The time that literary societies cease to exist marks what I call the dark period for signers. While some considered starting our history anew, I suggest we look back beyond that period to shed light on the time when our history was suppressed. Illuminating the dark period doesn't require guesswork or starting over. We can reconstruct what was practiced in the more distant past. To do this, we have to take an archaeological approach, which was the basis of my book with Patricia Clark. We decided to call it Sign Language Archaeology because people largely only know contemporary histories of ASL, but aren't aware that there's much more to be uncovered. I'll share some of our discoveries. We organized what we found into a timeline and marked each era by well-known figures associated with each time period, as shown here: De la Paix, Clare, and Veditz. De la Paix founded the School for the Deaf in Paris. When Americans wanted to start a school, they brought over a French deaf teacher named Laurent Clare. But that's the extent of the history that we're told. The Veditz film was only found relatively recently, having been largely abandoned and collecting dust. It can now take its rightful place as a new chapter in our history. Where are these histories primarily kept? Not much is written, but we found films and sign language dictionaries that contain more information than we had realized. The books predate the dark period and helped us better understand our history. Going back to the first image of De la Paix, look closely at the bottom right corner. The image is dated 1760, which is the same year the school opened, marking the beginning of LSF. In his film, Veditz credits De la Paix as the inventor of our signs, but as I will show, that wasn't the case. What often happens is that deaf people who join the community later in life take these stories as truth, and, seeing the same names mentioned over and over, come to believe that the language was invented. But if you take another look at the picture of De la Paix and recall the story of the expansion of the French method, he had met two deaf sisters. We can infer that that is who is pictured here with him. He's watching them, and they understood each other, but nobody had taught them those signs. They must have been using a home sign system. They provided evidence that deaf people could be skilled language users and could communicate their ideas, which is why De la Paix knew it was worth starting a school where people would sign. Americans had heard about this school and also accepted the idea, which is why they undertook the same policy and plans as the French, largely importing their same approach. Along with that model, they had help not from instructional materials, but from Laurent Clerc. That one school paved the way for others around the country. There's a wealth of documentation linking American Sign Language to LSF. At that time, LSF was still in use, of course, so ASL and LSF continued on their own parallel evolutionary courses and are no longer the same because they changed independently. If an ASL user and an LSF user were to meet today, they wouldn't understand each other. We plan to do more research, building backwards from 1817, extending beyond 1760. There are old books in French with illustrations that we'll rely on, which leads to my next point: making historical sign language materials accessible. I wanted to build something to make these historical materials readily available. So, I built a database to serve as a repository of films and images. It's hosted here at Georgetown University and is publicly accessible. We don't have all the materials there yet, we're still working on it, but here are some examples of what's there. Pictures from dictionaries, with text from the dictionary entries below each image. Now, the films didn't come with translations, so we used dictionaries to verify our interpretations of the archaic signs used from 1910 to 1920. These films fill a gap between books that were published before and after that decade, allowing us to study continuous historical changes that validate ASL as a heritage language. What's unique about heritage languages is that they aren't invented by an individual. They're the result of a community coming together and building a language and history that eventually becomes a way of life. How do we do that now in order to empower collaboration for introducing this unique heritage to children and parents, thus enlightening society? By building a resource that hearing parents can turn to when facing questions about how to raise their deaf children. If they knew this history, they could imagine how their child would take part in this legacy. It can also serve as a response to larger society's demands for proof about signed languages. The fundamental message is that data exists that proves that the formation of sign language through time is just like the formation of other languages of the world. That's the point I hope you take away. To conclude, I'd like to thank my many collaborators, research participants, and funders. This work was done with grant support from NSF grants BCS 0925073 and BCS 1455756. A second set of grants comes from NIH and NEH fellowships. I'd like to thank my research team at Georgetown University for their support. I'd also like to acknowledge school and university archivists for the information and materials that are currently scattered around the country. School librarians and archivists are wonderful custodians of these long-neglected historical artifacts. Finally, I'd like to thank my dear friend, co-author, and archaeological collaborator, Patricia Clark. I'd also like to announce a forthcoming book with Matthew Malskoon entitled Home Movies Hardly Silent, which discusses home movies that feature sign language. We're anticipating a 2023 publication date. The value of home movies relates to what I mentioned earlier. Families made films without the expectation that they'd be used as data. So we want to encourage people to preserve and pass down their home movies because they're a part of our history.